PewDiePie recently started drawing and he's actually pretty good.
I drew these? How?
That got me thinking.
10 minutes a day for 30 days only equates to 5 hours.
That's not a lot. How far can you actually get with just 5 hours of work? I decided to run an experiment. Let's take a person that genuinely has zero art background, put a pencil in his hand, and see how far he can get. Let me introduce you to today's test subject, my partner, Rinky. Not everyone knows this, but PewDiePie actually has some experience in the visual arts. He's done some photoshopping and photo manipulation, so he isn't actually starting from absolute zero. Rinky, on the other hand...
That's my quant.
Your what?
My quantitative. My math specialist.
...is experienced with financial modeling and Excel. His spreadsheets look kinda pretty sometimes, but we're starting as close to zero as we can. Pewds also had someone near him that could give him feedback, but not everyone does. So to keep things fair, I tried my best not to help at all. As you will see later, sticking to this rule proved very difficult at times, because at some points I had to really struggle to not intervene. So it all started, my partner asked me if I had an extra monitor, and I said sure. I did have my travel tablet lying around, an XP Pen Artist Pro 16 Generation 2. Presumably he was intending to use it for more spreadsheet stuff. But hey, since it's plugged in, why not try drawing a bit? So I gave him my spare Clip Studio Paint 1.0 license. Kind of overkill for a beginner, but whatever. So Rinky started by practicing drawing straight lines. This is a pretty good idea, even if you're starting with pen and paper. Everyone has written on paper before, but the motion of drawing long, smooth lines isn't exactly the same. He actually found it easier to use the mouse initially. He also encountered his first problem early on. While a display tablet simulates the experience of drawing on paper, it isn't exactly the same. In particular, he found the pressure sensitivity very difficult to get used to. He actually found it easier to work in Paint, where he didn't have to worry about that. The solution required a bit of trial and error, but he discovered that tweaking the pen pressure setting in the tablet driver was the answer. Every artist likes to use different amounts of pressure, so it's important to find a pressure curve that's comfortable for you. And listen, when I say this person has no experience drawing, I really mean none. I noticed he was holding the pen way up here for some reason. He actually asked me, how am I supposed to hold the pen? The answer is like a regular pen, by the way. And at this point, he wasn't looking at any guides or resources, so he kind of developed his own way of thinking. He figured that drawing straight lines between 2 points is similar to FPS aim training, except only the accuracy mattered and not the speed. So he tried an interesting exercise where he traced along the edges of a maze, but he found those lines a bit too short to be useful. He also found that drawing over the same line repeatedly worked better for his aim practice. He would go back and forth between 2 points like he was aiming between 2 targets. At this point, he was making sure he was spending no more than 10 minutes per drawing in order to properly stick to the experiments. If he ran out of time, as he did here, he would simply stop. The next problem he encountered was that he found he wasn't quite able to draw long, smooth lines by only using his wrist. But since he was already thinking about aim practice in FPS games, he realized that using his entire arm to draw should result in straighter, more precise lines. I guess it's kind of similar to why you don't want to have high mouse sensitivity when you're aiming, right? This is something that artists are taught to do pretty early on, but he figured it out himself through his gaming experiences. Remember how he was trying to hold his pen at the beginning, all the way up here? Apparently his palm was sticking to the surface of the tablet, so he was trying to draw lines by gripping the pen really high up. This is another thing that makes drawing on a tablet different from drawing on paper. He ended up resolving it by placing a piece of paper under his hand while drawing, but it still didn't feel quite right. In the end, I offered him one of those 2-finger digital artist gloves that are designed to solve this specific problem. Once his palm could glide smoothly on the screen, it was a lot easier to achieve straighter lines. And hey, look, the lines are definitely straighter now. At day 9, he started drawing some boxes because he heard that's kinda good for learning art. However, he was still trying to avoid looking at guides and references online, so he grabbed a Rubik's Cube, held it in his hand, and just sorta stared at it to try to figure out how to draw boxes. To be honest, finding a real-life reference is actually a pretty good strategy. There is an issue with this though. A Rubik's Cube is pretty small, so it's really difficult to see the vanishing points on something this tiny. And the whole point of drawing boxes, of course, is to draw those converging lines to get a sense of perspective. So, to make it all make sense in his head, he resorted to doing math. So I was just minding my own business when he just rocked up and stated, so the cube becomes about 40% taller when you rotate it towards you by 45 degrees around the bottom edge, which is something I have never thought about in my entire artistic life. And since he wasn't looking at any guides or references at the time, he was trying to figure everything out from scratch himself. So here are his calculations for anyone else who wants to know. Honestly, it's probably easier to look at photographs or at other artists' drawings as reference rather than trying to figure it out all by yourself. So at day 10, I realized there was a big problem with our experiments. See, generally people who want to start learning to draw are people who are typically interested in drawing and art in the first place. Rinky is not one of those people. If I had left him to his own devices, he would have continued to draw boxes and lines for the remainder of the experiment. So it was time
for a small intervention.
First off, spending only 10 minutes per drawing was way too restrictive and was forcing him to rush every drawing. So he could opt to spend another 10-minute session on the same drawing to finish it if he wanted. I also told him to go draw something else, something that he wanted to draw, but there was nothing that he wanted to draw. So I just told him to draw Pokemon. He kind of likes Pokemon, but more importantly, Pokemon are relatively simple and recognizable, so not too difficult to draw. At this point, he started using a pale yellow color as a sketch before using the black for the liner. He hadn't quite figured out how to use layers yet. On day 12, Rinky drew Denji from Chainsaw Man, and then he drew these ducks. He wasn't particularly happy with either of these drawings, but he decided to move on anyway. It was then that I realized that him not caring about art does give him a kind of unexpected advantage. Even when he notices mistakes or errors in his drawings, he doesn't spend too long dwelling on them and just keeps them in mind for his next drawing, instead of stressing over a completed drawing. I think this is actually pretty healthy. So you might be noticing that while his lines are more fluid now, drawing with his entire arm led to another problem. As he is right-handed, he noticed that he had a hard time drawing on the right edge of his tablet because he had nowhere to rest his hand. It's a real problem for smaller tablets. That is why tablets often have large bezels. It's a feature, not a bug. It's also why people have created products like this. It was at this point he had to finally start learning how to use the drawing application, Clip Studio Paint. If he was having trouble drawing at the edge of the tablets, he could just move the canvas so that he was drawing at the center. Problem solved. This might sound funny to more experienced digital artists because you probably do this instinctively, but it was something we all had to learn at the very beginning. So there might be some people thinking, wait, this isn't bad. This is actually looking quite a lot better than my first few hours. So most of you probably already know this, but here's a reminder for those of you that don't. At this point, Rinky is drawing from reference. He's taking drawings that already exist and he's just copying them. And there's nothing wrong with this. Drawing from reference is fine and good. However, it is a separate skill set from drawing from imagination. And you don't even have to draw from imagination if you don't want to. Here's his first attempt drawing from imagination. So, not quite as good as his attempts at drawing from reference, which is completely understandable. He doesn't really like them, but I personally think they have a certain charming quality that I really like. And to be honest, calling it drawing from imagination is a bit of a misnomer in my opinion. It would be more accurate to call it drawing from memory. And you can't draw what you haven't put into your memory in the first place. And how do you put things into your memory? By drawing from reference, of course. But besides drawing from photo reference, you can also draw from life. Rinky tried it for the first time on day 15 and drew his tablet setup. He did have some trouble with this because he realized that the perspective and angles of everything changed as he moved his head. So it's easier to draw from photos for this reason. The perspective and angle has already been set and it doesn't change or move like it does in life. So here are a bunch of trees he drew from imagination on day 17 and 18, mostly to experiment a little more with pen pressure and to get accustomed to the feeling of it. I love this bird over here, isn't it the cutest? Around this time, he discovered that instead of trying to get the right line all the time, it was easier for him to sculpt shapes. He would paint in large blocks of black and then use the eraser to get the shape that he wanted. He called it cheating, but it's not really. Some people, like me, like to think in terms of lines, and others think in terms of shape. Both of them are perfectly valid. But anyway, since he was using lots of black shapes, he decided to try and copy a drawing from an artist that also did that, Tite Kubo, the artist of Bleach. This drawing of Rukia took significantly more effort, requiring 30 minutes. And at the end of it all, he wasn't very happy with the results. He thought it looked completely different from the reference image, and he wasn't too sure why. I ended up doing a very quick fix for him. It still isn't perfect, but it's a bit better. The only real problem here was that his proportions were a bit off. Being able to observe and approximate proportions is one of the first and most important things that a beginner with art can learn. When you start out, a common reason for a drawing looking off is that the proportions are not quite right. Next, here's a drawing of Goku that he did from the legendary Akira Toriyama. May he rest in peace. So here's the interesting thing about trying to replicate an image. It forces you to look much more closely at it than you normally would. Renki has been a Dragon Ball fan since childhood, but it was only when he tried drawing a Dragon Ball character that he finally noticed, wait, don't all these characters' faces look kind of similar? There's nothing wrong with that, of course, but I find it really funny that it took him this long to notice. Here's more Pokemon that he drew from the Pokedance video. He was also dissatisfied with this one because, in his own words, it looks like a child drew it. So he just tried again, but this time he tried to measure the proportions more carefully. And it came out a lot better this time. This was also his very first time using Layer, so hooray for technology! He went back to boxes briefly after this and drew a few more of them. Wait, hang on. These actually look really good. They look really accurate. I asked him how he managed this, and apparently he had developed this 2D coordinate system to memorize how each of the boxes looked at various angles. So this is what the box actually looks like in his head. This was actually pretty weird to me since I've never thought of boxes in this way. I try to visualize them in 3D space rather than thinking of them as a set of 2D points. His theory is that if he memorizes the 2D coordinates of boxes from a whole bunch of angles, he should be able to construct anything out of boxes from any angle. Honestly, I'm not really sure how to feel about this. Leave a comment and let me know what you think about it. So here we are, at the final day of the experiment. Of course, I asked him to draw my favorite Pokemon again, Clodsire. How much was he really able to learn from 5 hours of practice? What does the culmination of all his practice look like? So here it is, the final results. Oh, and here's also the Clodsire he drew earlier for comparison. You could definitely see a bit of improvement. His lines are smoother and more confident, and he was able to follow the reference more closely. But it's not like he made a shocking amount of improvement either. Because it turns out that 10 minutes a day for 30 days isn't very long at all. I feel that some people have unrealistic expectations because drawing is hard. And you're surrounded by people who post their astonishing art gains, but remember, the people that didn't see much improvement probably aren't going to be making a YouTube video about it. And even if it is uploaded, it's less likely to get recommended. This is known as survivorship bias, so don't feel too discouraged if you're not seeing progress right away. Also, I think it might be better to draw for 10 minutes minimum every day, since 10 minutes realistically is barely enough time to get started on a single drawing. Finally, let's talk about the experiments, limitations, and biases. Renki didn't actually draw for 10 minutes a day for 30 days, but for 30 10-minute sessions for a total of 5 hours over 2 days. But I think it's actually close enough for the purposes of our experiments. Anyway, I hope this video was interesting. Draw the subscribe button for 30 days if you liked it, and hope to see you next time. Bye-bye! Not quite as good as his attempts at drawing from reference. I have a sore throat, man. Let me introduce you to today. How do I say the word today? Let me introduce you to today's... What the heck?